I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this government has got a lot to answer for with backward policies and investment decisions on transport issues. Now, anyone who read the Waikato Times today will have seen quite an interesting article in it, and it refers to, quote, a disturbing lack of an overall transport strategy instead of, quote, pulling together road, rail and maritime services into a coordinated effort. And they also refers to roads are jammed with the national fleet of giant trucks up to 50 feet wearing out the expensive seal and choking main roads. And, quote, while the adjacent rail system seems to be in a potentially fatal decline. And finally, it points out, quote, main roads and the rail lines run side by side for hundreds of kilometres, unquote. Now, Mr Speaker, the Waikato Times is absolutely correct. None of that makes any sense at all. The government has no transport strategy, it has no sensible transport plans, and it has no coordinated transport policies. And, Mr Speaker, in the regions, huge trucks inflict massive damage on regional roads, with the costs falling on regional ratepayers to maintain them. Now, regional roads are, of course, subsidised by central government, but there is a sinking cap on the available finances, and that puts intolerable stress on not just the roading systems, but on councils in the regions to maintain those roads. And the national government has, again, no strategy to deal with those issues. Mr Speaker, rail itself needs much more investment in New Zealand, and New Zealand First is the party for the regions, because we would put that right. Now, there's only $97 million in this year's budget for regional roads, and there's only $210 million set aside for improvement on rail. These are drops in the transport bucket and will make no difference to anything. What it shows is an absolute lack of commitment by this government to both rail and to regional transport generally. And, Mr Speaker, you can see some of the dumb decisions this government has made, such as the failure to reopen the Napier to Gisborne rail link at a cost of only $4 million. And now that we have the probable, or at least possible, phasing out of log shipments from Gisborne Port itself, that rail link will become even more important. And, Mr Speaker, Kiwi Rail and management, and with government compliance, wants to phase out or de-electrify rail on the main trunk line from Hamilton to Palmerston North. New Zealand First, on the other hand, would electrify the entire Auckland to Wellington route, because that is what needs to be done for a sustainable transport system in this country. The minister over there says, at what cost? What about the $12 billion that party is spending on motorways? What about that? What about the cost of that? Let's hear an answer for that. And, Mr Speaker, there is also a need for a passenger link from Auckland City to the airport in that city. We're not hearing anything about that sort of urban passenger rail development from this government. The Cook Strait ferries are another disaster area. They soon won't have a rail ferry at all. And what that means is that wagons and locomotives will have to be double-handled onto and off the Cook Strait ferries, wagons double-handled freight onto and off the rubber-tired trailers on and off those ferries. And, Mr Speaker, the South Island wagons and locomotives will be stranded in the South Island, even though the only heavy transport facility actually is in the North Island. So how will that work? We haven't heard any solutions from this half-witted government on that. And, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First has a policy called RONI, Railways of National Importance, instead of National's RONS, Roads of National Significance. We would ensure much better use of the railway network and services in New Zealand, with improvements and extensions where there's an opportunity to significantly reduce dependence on the road network, and that's what people want, especially for heavy freight and for bulk freight services, but also where there's a passenger service demand, which would lead to a redevelopment of high-quality passenger rail services in the main centres. And, Mr Speaker, that can be achieved in the short term, as I just said, by reallocating some of the RON's $12 billion being squandered by this government at the present time. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First wants a New Zealand transport system to begin a new phase, which is strategic rather than reactionary, which is sustainable, which meets the need of our people and our communities, and which is affordable and enhances and does not degrade our economy and our environment. Mr Speaker, National can't even do anything sensible in the transport area about tourist drivers. As you may be aware, Mr Speaker, I have a private member's bill which would require cars hired to overseas licence holders to comply with the Australasian 5-star safety rating. Now, the Minister said last week in answer to one of my questions, quote, "What the member's bill proposes would result in actually only the latest model BMWs and European cars over $100,000. In fact, you can buy 10 Euro NCAP 5-star rated Skoda Fabias for the price of Mr Foss's own BMW ministerial limousine." Mr Speaker, the Skoda car is a $19,900 car, but has autonomous emergency braking, which senses an impending collision so that the brakes are applied automatically. And the humble Ford Mondeo is another good example. In fact, it's a virtual cornucopia of traffic safety devices, which include a lane-keeping aid, which vibrates the steering wheel when a driver drifts out of a lane. And that's what's happening too often with tourist drivers in this country. Imagine, Mr Speaker, what that would mean to reducing the risk of head-on collisions, which we are seeing far too many of in this country at the present time. The problem, Mr Speaker, is an absence of leadership by the national government and by an Associate Minister of Transport who is hopelessly out of his depth. The bill would also place a duty of care on rental car operators to make them vicariously liable for accidents caused by drivers only if it can be proved that they did not take reasonable and practical steps to ensure driver competence and their familiarity with New Zealand traffic laws and roads. Now, Mr Foss's response to that situation was, quote, "I am not transferring that liability to some other organisation," unquote. But the bill doesn't transfer responsibility away for the driver. It simply makes rental car operators additionally liable unless they've taken the steps I mentioned. I want to finish with this, Mr Speaker. There's currently a review of vehicle dimensions and mass review going on. In fact, the submissions close tomorrow to allow huge, wider, longer, higher and heavier trucks on New Zealand's roads. That is a disgrace. The economic case for that has not been made out. Safety will be a huge problem as a result. And that, finally, Mr Speaker, is just another example of how this government has not got a sensible, practical, forward-looking and sustainable transport strategy which this country so dearly needs.